Sure, next. We can move on. This is our agenda right here. Next slide. To start things off, I would like to introduce Empire Clean Cities, the organization hosting this event. Empire Clean Cities is a New York-based nonprofit committed to clean air and providing information about alternative fuel vehicles and technologies to stakeholders. Our electric vehicle campaign, Mission Electric, specifically focuses on educating about the benefits of EVs. Next slide. This is our team from Empire Clean Cities. Joy and David are here with me today. Next slide. And one back. Empire Clean Cities provides a number of valuable services to support the adoption of alternative fuels, including education and outreach, planning assistance for fleets, funding identification, data collection and analysis, and more, as you can see here. Next slide. Additionally, Empire Clean Cities serves as the U.S. Department of Energy's designated Clean Cities Coalition for New York City and Hudson Valley region. We are part of a national network of over 75 coalitions working to reduce emissions and petroleum consumptions in the transportation sector. This is a 30-year-old DOE program, which provides access to data, competitive funding, and expertise to enable alternative fuel adoption. Next slide. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Scott Fenwick from Clean Fuels Alliance America, who will discuss the benefits, considerations, and future of renewable fuels for fleets. Scott.
Unmute, Scott.
There we go. Thanks, Laura. Thanks to Empire Clean Cities for hosting this event, and thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today. We can go to the next slide. I want to talk with you briefly and thank all of our funding organization. Clean Fuels Alliance America is the national trade association representing renewable fuels like biodiesel, renewable diesel, and now sustainable aviation fuels here across the United States. And so these are some of our farmer leader organizations that enable me to join you here today and enable Clean Fuels to do all the work that we do on behalf of the entire industry. Next slide. Clean Fuels Alliance America, I talked about, we're a trade organization. We actually don't have any fuel to supply or to sell. But as a trade organization, we do represent those stakeholders of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and SAF, with the goal of those fuels being recognized as mainstream, low carbon fuels with superior performance and emission characteristics in all diesel fueled applications, whether that be on-road, off-road, power generation, home heating oils, and a variety of others, railroad and marine. We expect to be 6 billion gallons by the year 2030, and potentially 50 million gallons or 15 billion gallons by 2050, with some advances in feedstock use. To give you a sense of what that means for the market, over the last several years, in spite of the pandemic, the U.S. consumes approximately 60 billion gallons of distillates each and every year. And so at 6 billion, we'd be roughly 10% of the marketplace. Next slide, please. We want to talk about renewable diesel today and note that it is different than biodiesel. Both are renewable fuels. Both can be used, as I mentioned, in any diesel fueled or compression ignition engine, diesel fueled application. Both utilize the same types of feedstocks, those commercial grades of fats, oils, greases that are available in the marketplace. So whether or not those are virgin vegetable oils, used cooking oils, animal fats from rendering facilities, those are the feedstocks that are competing in the marketplace for these different fuels. Biodiesel, you can see there on the bottom, actually has oxygen content within its molecular composition that enhances some of the emissions that biodiesel has, whereas renewable diesel, that's the topic for our discussion today, through its processing, through a traditional refinery and hydroprocessing, ends up being a hydrocarbon that is indistinguishable from petroleum distillate fuels, except for carbon dating, C14 testing that would be done in the marketplace. Next slide. Here's just a sense of where we're coming from over the last 13, 14 years. And you can see the growth in our industry. So the graph here on your left encompasses both biodiesel and renewable diesel. And at the very top, you can see other biofuels, which would include sustainable aviation fuels. And over the last several years, you can see the enormous growth of renewable diesel across the United States. We're seeing several refiners transition either entirely to renewable diesel production, as is the case with a facility up in North Dakota, whereas others may dedicate certain aspects within their gates just for the production of renewable diesel. A lot of people have claimed that, you know, the growth of renewable diesel may diminish biodiesel production. I don't necessarily believe that to be the case. I believe there's going to be spots for both fuels in the marketplace. They do have different characteristics, and both will play in different markets for different customers and different applications. But there's still growth to be had. Again, we're only at 3.5 billion gallons today, so a little more than halfway towards our projected growth by the year 2030. And still some projections for additional volumes and capacity of renewable diesel coming online across the US over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. But I would hate for you to take my word for it. And so Clean Fuels is all about, you know, the research that we do and providing evidence, whether it be through technical papers or citations from other industry experts. And so the EIA, government agency on fuels, has revised their estimates and demand for both biodiesel and renewable diesel throughout the next couple of years. And they're seeing increased demand and supply of both fuels. Sustainable aviation fuel, they are hoping will account for 30% of the overall renewable fuel production by the year 2030. And like I say, there will be considerable competition for those feedstocks of those commercial grades of fats, oils, and greases. Obviously, there's always the technical portion to consider, which is my role within Clean Fuels as technical director. But certainly federal, state regulatory programs, legislation, not just within the US, but all around the world, will have an impact on the volumes and direction. But we expect significant growth over the next several years, at least through the rest of this decade. Next slide, please. I want to talk specifically now about renewable diesel. You know, what does it take? What has Clean Fuels done over the last several years? What does it take in general for renewable fuels to make their mark in the fuels marketplace today? Certainly, we talked about federal policy, mentioned the Renewable Fuel Standard at play. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed recently is going to transition some of this legislation, some of these policies from a blender's tax credit to a clean fuel producer credit in 2025. But we're also looking for the technical side of this. What are the appropriate test methods to measure these new fuels and determine whether or not their performance in an engine is adequate and compatible with today's diesel fuel. So Clean Fuels has been involved with a lot of OEMs, those original equipment manufacturers, both vehicle and engine manufacturers that produce compression ignition engine. We update them routinely on changing regulations, whether those are federal, state, could be the EPA, it could be the California Air Resources Board. We're working on fuel specifications. Renewable diesel today meets those same ASTM specifications that can be found in D 975, which cover traditional petroleum diesel fuel as well. But we're looking at durability. The EPA recently adopted new emissions requirements for diesel engines beginning in 2027, where they've tightened the emissions requirement, another 90% reduction in emissions such as particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions, while extending the full useful life of heavy-duty engines from 435,000 miles up to 800,000 miles. And so while we don't see any of those new engines on the road yet today, those engine manufacturers are still working on the technologies to do that. Clean Fuels is already involved in testing both biodiesel and renewable diesel to ensure that it will provide that same expectation of performance even under these new regulations and requirements. We're also working on consumer confidence. It's all about education, state policies, compatibility. The one good thing about these fuels, renewable diesel I mentioned, is a hydrocarbon, indistinguishable from today's petroleum distillates. And so we want to make sure that it works with the infrastructure, both on board the vehicle and up to the vehicle, both through distribution, pipelines, terminals, retail pumps. We're working on all of that to make sure that today's newer fuels are still compatible with the older fuels. Next slide, please. So our technical objectives are to prioritize work needed for renewable fuels in 2030 and 2050. Now that's a ways out, but for engine manufacturers, they're already, like I say, designing their engines, getting ready to go into production for engines that will be rolling out in 2027. And so you have to maintain 5 to 10 years out to work on these issues prior to it rolling out for today's consumers. We want to focus on markets that make the most sense for higher volumes, higher blends. Again, as technical director, we view our objectives to address any technical barriers that would prevent users, consumers, from higher blends. Again, R50, R100, or just higher volumes in general across all the different applications. We're looking for higher baseline levels of OEM support, whilst looking specifically at different blends in the marketplace. There's certainly going to be different applications, different customers that are going to approve and prefer different fuels in the marketplace. And what may work best for a marine market may not be what's best for a fleet in New York City. But while we're working cooperatively with those original equipment manufacturers, we want to work with the fleets and the adopters of these new fuels as well. And so we're excited. You know, you're going to hear more from New York Times. You'll likely hear more in the news and press releases from New York City and DCAS and other municipalities, both within New York and up and down the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, as well as across the country. In doing this research, we want to provide a differentiation and advantages for support of these high blends. I mentioned earlier, it's not just durability, it's not just compatibility with today's current fuels, but we believe that there are certain advantages. By using higher renewable diesel blends, you can reduce the particulate matter, the soot emissions from today's vehicles. Those lower soot emissions basically mean less wear and tear on the engine hardware, like the diesel particulate filters that are part of the emissions after treatment systems on all vehicles nowadays. And so by extending the useful life of those particulate filters, we can lessen the maintenance costs for a lot of fleets today as well. Certainly not every engine manufacturer may land at the same type of technology. And so we want to be able to work with each and every one of these because these engines are going to be sold in a global marketplace and they're not going to be specific to any particular application or particular market. And so we're working very closely on renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, not to mention our traditional biodiesel fuels, to investigate the questions that these engine manufacturers still have. Next slide, please. Did want to mention very briefly, Clean Fuels does host an annual conference this year, beginning of February. We'll be in Fort Worth. And so if you are interested in hearing more, getting more details, more specifics about certain fuels, certain applications, certain uses, we do have a great agenda for 2.5 days that you might want to check that out and see if that might be an option for you. Next slide. And lastly, I wanted to point out some additional tools and resources that may be of interest. The Alternative Fuels Data Center, or AFDC, has a website where you can find fuel station locators for renewable diesel, and that link is here. And this organization, is part of the Department of Energy and Clean Cities, actually does confirm the sale of these renewable diesel fuels at each and every one of the locations that they post. Groups such as the Coordinating Research Council have research papers out there that are free and available for you. One such is listed here on renewable hydrocarbon diesel fuel, the properties and performance review. Clean Fuels Alliance America, the organization that I work for, has plenty of data and information on our website, as well as then organizations like the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We just posted a 6th revision for the biodiesel handling and use guide, if that might serve as research and information on renewable fuels in general for the marketing public out there as well. Laura, one more slide. Joy, I think that's all I have. I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Scott. So with that, I'm introducing Stephen Levy from Sprague Energy. Stephen.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you, Empire Clean Cities, for hosting today. And Scott, as always, great presentation. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. So I wanted to share with you this particular slide for a couple of reasons. One is that Sprague has been around since 1870, and the reason why it has been because it continues to evolve, and what was done in 1870 with shipping and whale oil is not the same thing as we do today with fuels and programs and products and services. And when we talk about renewable diesel, I always like to go back to 2000 when Sprague pioneered and commercialized ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, which was a heavier challenge than it is for renewable. Why? Because a whole new infrastructure had to be established. We had lower sulfur fuels, had to be sure that the sulfur would not be increased. And the reason for that was because of the diesel particulate filters that were coming on the market. So this was 10 years before an EPA mandate, along with a few years later with biodiesel and bioheat. But as time went on and as our offerings continued, about 5 years ago, after seeing what was happening in California and the benefits of using renewable diesel and more discussion about decarbonizing fleets here in the Northeast, Sprague was able to bring in renewable diesel for several pilot projects. And after the success of those projects, this past June, we committed to renewable diesel here in our Bronx facility. Next slide, please. And, as Dave Glendon says, our CEO, no matter what is happening in the world, and we're always looking for the demand or what the customers need to keep their fleets operating economically and efficiently. And today, on a sustainability option, especially now dealing with renewable diesel. Next slide, please. And, as Scott brought up about the benefits of renewable diesel, here in the Northeast, it's always about the fleet and the building management people, what's in it for me. And, renewable diesel is just, just a superior product. It's not a fossil fuel. It's a drop-in fuel and easy to use. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. And the key thing here as well is when you look at the quality of performance, as Scott mentioned, it meets D975 for all types of diesel equipment. whether you're on-site, off-site, whether it's farm equipment, whether it's generators, whether it's power generation equipment, as well as also meeting the specs of D396, which is a heating fuel spec as well. Next slide, please. And I wanted to bring up, when we talk about supply, not all renewable diesel is the same. But one good thing about it is when you look at your cetane ratings for it, it is extremely high. Normally when diesel fuel comes into New York Harbor, it's meeting a 40 to a 42 cetane, although for many of our customers, we have to meet a little higher to a 45. But when you see the cetane ratings for renewable diesel, we haven't seen anything lower than a 75. So it's as Scott mentioned about running that engine cleaner, this has a lot to do with it. But also, and importantly, when product comes into the Northeast, we need to worry about winter operability. And when we say not all renewable diesel is the same, some may have a very high cloud point, which means it gels, at a very high number. But we've made a commitment to bring in renewable diesel that, as you can see from this independent spec, when you look at the cloud point as a -13, when normally a cloud point in the winter from the pipeline or in the harbor could be at a +10, and blending with kerosene could bring you down to a 0. This is very good winter operability. And when we talk about for some of the fleets that don't blend with kerosene and use an additive as a pour point depressor, you can see when you're looking at the specifications of renewable diesel without an additive, it's this particular product's at a -20 degrees Fahrenheit. So very good winter operability. Next slide, please. And as Scott also mentioned, supply is being increased for renewable diesel, but this is important to us here in the Northeast. As we can see in California, where renewable diesel now is the most widely used diesel product in the West Coast, especially in California, as additional refineries are switching over to produce renewable diesel, more processing units are coming on board, this product needs a place to go. And it's coming to the Northeast, and it's in dribs and drabs now, but some of us that have made a commitment to it. But the key is, as more and more is becoming available, there's opportunities here. Now, granted, it's not like the early 90s with CNG and build it and they will come. They never came. In this particular instance, excuse me, because of sustainability efforts and people want to decarbonize and looking for cleaner fuels, it's with the advent of increased production, price differentials coming to New York has been coming down, making it more economical to use in our fleets. Now, keep in mind that in California and the West Coast, the price of renewable diesel and their diesel fuel is comparable, meaning it's equal to the same prices for diesel and renewable. In the Northeast, we don't have what they have in California, which is a clean fuel standard or a low carbon fuel standard. Last year, this was almost legislated in New York. It didn't get passed. If it does get passed this year in New York or any of the other states where other states would follow, this would also help for the building of credits that would also bring down the price of renewable diesel here as well. Next slide. And when you talk about the supply chain, so renewable diesel is almost the same supply chain as we have with traditional fossil fuel supply. Only a few differences today. One that will always be, and that is, remember, renewable diesel is coming from sustainably sourced renewable raw materials, use cooking oil, trap grease, chicken tallow, soybean oil, and that gets collected by trucks, gets transported, could be by rail car or by cargo, goes to a processor refining unit for production. After it gets produced today, and and maybe Scott can shed some light on at the end of the presentations, it's only being transported to the Northeast by cargo. And most of it is being transported by cargo around the world, whereby traditional fuels, gasoline, jet fuel, heating oil, diesel, can come to the Northeast, via pipeline, via cargo, via rail, and via truck. So what that means is that, yes, it's coming by cargo. We have to ensure that we have enough storage capacity here. And once it gets here and it gets stored in our terminals, we would then transport it similar like we do now for your regular diesel fuel. It goes in the same trucks it could be delivered. It goes into the same tanks that you have, gets pumped through the same pump and goes through the vehicles that you have. And it can go to the fleet, marine, power plants, generators, truck stops, and property management companies, as we talked about. On that note as well, there's several fleets in New York that have transitioned. Sprague has transitioned some of its fleet where it's essentially fueled using renewable diesel as well. And the reason for that is that not just to reduce our emissions, but although we've been using it now just for a couple of months, we're also looking to the benefits of having a cleaner, less maintained vehicle as well. Next slide, please. And, as I mentioned, we've made the commitment at Sprague. There will be others that will. It is available in our Bronx terminal, both for delivery and loading of the rack. And as demand increases, availability will continue to expand. Next slide, please. And not just, in New York, but, we're already having plans to have it available in upstate New York. And again, as demand increases, people like Sprague, and we will expand it through our footprint as well. Next slide, please. And I thank you very much for the time, and I look forward to your Q&A.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Now I'd like to introduce Zach Miller from Trucking Association of New York for his presentation. Zach.
Hi, thank you. And thanks so much for having me here talking about this really important topic. So industry prefers to use the term zero and near zero emission vehicles because different fuels and technologies work better for different fleets, especially now as more work needs to be done to facilitate the large scale adoption of electric and hydrogen powered vehicles. We're agnostic when it comes to fuel or technology. Our aim is to ensure that our members and really the industry at large are aware of all the options the marketplace has to offer as they build out their transition plans to get to that goal of net zero by 2050. So renewable diesel is one we'd really like to see significantly expand on the East Coast because it does offer tremendous benefit both to the industry and the communities that we serve, which, in New York City is all of them. Trucks deliver 90% of freight in New York City. Renewable diesel meets the conventional petroleum ASTM D975 specification, which allows it to be used in existing infrastructure and diesel engines while reducing both carbon dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions when compared to petroleum diesel. And the numbers we've seen, range from 65 to 70% reduction. So rather significant there. And to that end, we've been asking for options on the road to electrification. This is absolutely an outstanding one. I always learn more and more every time I go to, webinars and meetings and events about renewable diesel. And it really is successful, so much so that pilot truck stops is only going to be selling renewable and biodiesel in California, by the new year. So just a couple of weeks away from that. And I really liked Steve's map, showing the sort of increased capacity there, because I think it's really important that the fleets on the webinar know that you have purchasing power here. You have the ability to ask your suppliers for renewable diesel, if they have renewable diesel, to really, as you build out that 2050 transition plan, to look at renewable diesel as a big part of it, particularly, over the next 5-10 years here, as the electrification, as the hydrogen really starts to get built out. And we talked about some of the other advantages, the drop in fuel, the fact that it reduces emissions, of course, the fact that it reduces regen time, that it works wonderfully in cold weather, things like that, things that the industry has been asking for. So I really do encourage you to look at this with the real hard lens and use this as your transition fuel moving forward here. And I think kick it to the next speaker.
All right, great. Thank you, Zach, for that. Now I'd like to introduce Nick D'Andrea from the New York Times for his presentation.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, team panel. Just a little user background. I'm Nick D'Andrea from the New York Times, the Vice President of Production in College Point, Queens. I'll just tell you a little bit about our operation. We print about 60 different publications and editions each week from College Point, distributing primarily in the tri-state area. We do have some longer runs down to West Virginia and up north to Albany, but most of our fleet and distributions in the tri-state area. We have 79 trucks and tractors, a combination of 79 in our fleet. We started converting our fleet to EV. We ordered 12 trucks, 3 were delivered this year, 9 tractors will be delivered in third quarter 24. The Times has a very ambitious emissions goals. We have a team of people throughout the organization looking at what we can do to reduce emissions. We're looking at a number of capital projects at the plant, solar, battery storage, et cetera. But we wanted to start having an impact now. So we entered into a pilot renewable diesel program with Sprague but back in June, and it lasted for 4 months. And we found that there were no operational changes. There were no modifications required for the trucks. There were no modifications required for the fuel tanks. We have 3 10,000-gallon tanks at the plant. Essentially, as Stephen and Scott had mentioned, it's essentially a drop-in fuel. Just we'll run it down a little bit to get the deliveries and just take it from there. It was a successful pilot program. So starting in January, we're going to take all of our deliveries with renewable diesel. We don't have a lot of data yet. I know Scott and Stephen will talk about some of the long-term benefits, but we're hoping that the cleaner burn will reduce maintenance costs and potentially increase miles per gallon. And the good news is that the nominal surcharge is trending down, as Stephen mentioned. So I'd be happy to answer any questions going forward.
All right, great. So we can move on to tools and resources. Before we go on to the Q&A portion, I just want to highlight some of the tools and resources we Empire Clean Cities compiled that might be useful for fleets considering renewable fuels. These includes guides, vehicle and fueling station databases, incentive information, OEM support statements, and analysis tools. Some more resources here, including more assessment tools, regulatory information, market projections, and tank compatibility guidance. Next, so we can move on to our Q&A portion. Please either enter your question into the chat or raise your hand and we can answer them. We have a question in the chat. Many climate advocates have been skeptical of BBDs, low GHG bona fides, as land use for virgin soybean oil feedstocks has generally not been accounted for when calculating carbon intensity. Increased demand for soybean oil also triggers increased demand for palm oil, which of course has been brought with its own environmental problems. Can you speak to these concerns? Anyone?
Yeah, I'm happy to take first crack at that. You know, and it's a good question. Thank you for bringing it up. First of all, I think that the old cliche, you know, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, really sticks out here. We have long-term goals to get to, you know, net zero, and this is a really strong pathway forward to it. You know, like I said, it is just not feasible to snap our fingers and have every medium and heavy duty vehicle on the road be electric or hydrogen today. And you know, I don't want to get into it too much, but frankly, you know, there are still concerns about the way that the electric vehicles are manufactured, some of the mining. There are some real serious emissions that go into building out those vehicles. Now, as we see more and more come to market, new technologies coming, you know, we expect those to be reduced as well. But I do think it's important to look at a lot of these transitions to get to where we need to go, instead of just assuming that we could get there, you know, with all electric or all hydrogen in the next couple of years.
Zach, I think that's a great answer. This is Scott. And if I can just expand upon that, I think you're absolutely right. There is no perfect solution to any problem. And that when you are looking at different solutions, whether or not it be low carbon liquid fuels that are available today versus electric vehicle options, you know, zero emission vehicles for the future, looking at the entire picture is what's really important. And so certainly there is a perception of this food versus fuel issue in the marketplace today. But what most don't understand is that soybeans make up 80% protein in the soybeans that they're grown. It's only 20% oil. And recently, as 20 years ago, there was such a glut of that soybean oil at the end of each commercial year after farmers have grown their crops. A lot of it was being dumped and disposed of in landfills. And so by having low carbon liquid fuels out there to utilize those excess oils and fats in the marketplace, it helps to relieve some of the financial pressure on that protein, on that meal that is serving the rest of the world, feeding the rest of the world. And so as the talks, there are dozens of different models that go into this, and each one handles things differently. But as talks turn into getting rid of row crops per se for energy crops, whether or not that be woody biomass or other options out there today, what you really have to understand is you're not only getting rid of that oil that the soybeans yield, that 20% oil, but you're also, for every acre that you displace with an energy crop for this purpose, you're also getting rid of 80% protein that feeds the rest of the world as well. And so, yeah, there's no perfect solution, but I agree with Zach. Looking at the entirety, mining for some of those specialty minerals that go into batteries and EVs needs to take place as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Next question you have is for Stephen. Are there any delivery minimums for Sprague trial program?
No, there isn't, but you know, it really depends on where you're located and what your infrastructure is. But if you're currently using diesel or heating oil now, there aren't any minimums.
Great, we have another question. So it's also for Stephen or Scott. If a fleet is interested in transitioning to renewable fuels, what is the timeline for that transition, and how long will it typically take for fleets to fuel on site?
You want to take that first, Stephen? Or?
Sure. So there isn't. I mean, it depends where you're located. So if you're located up in Maine, it's going to take a little time. But if you're in the tri-state area or in, you know, up along the Hudson River, there's product available now. And as we stated before as well, it's just a drop in fuel. It's just a transition from one fuel to the next.
Yeah, beyond the availability aspect, that Stephen can certainly attest to. From the technical point of view, the time to transition is immediate. If you have product available in your market, then there are no, as was stated earlier, there are no needs to change the fueling infrastructure that you've got, whether that be your tanks, your dispensers, your pumps, no modifications necessary to the vehicles and engines themselves. And so if you've got product available to you, that changeover can be immediate.
Great. And for Nick, will there be sharing, will the New York Times be sharing the findings from the renewable fuel pilot program?
Well, I guess if there'll be more panels like this, I will.
Oh, great. Do we have any other questions?
No, but I like to make, since if there aren't, I like to make another comment, and that,
Yeah.
the product is here in the tri-state area. It's going to only grow. If the clean fuel standard becomes part of it, it'll grow even more and bring even more supply. But I think in the end, some people will look at renewable diesel as a transition fuel, as Zach had mentioned, because we really can't flip the switch and be electric today. And if you're interested in reducing emissions today, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or particulate matter or NOx, you can do it today. And why wait? Because as we know, because of the supply and the supply chain and utility infrastructure, it's going to take a while to go electric, or hydrogen for that matter, depending on where you're operating your fleet. So this is one easy step to take to reduce emissions today.
Great.
Laura, if I might add really quick, there are always intended and unintended consequences to large changes like this. And so in addition to the vehicle benefits, the performance benefits that you'll achieve as a fleet or an end user, there are additional benefits by reducing particulate matter, by reducing nitrogen oxide emissions, particularly in densely populated areas where trucks are often idling or locomotives idling in neighborhoods. Those reduced emissions lead to health benefits as well. And so Clean Fuels has actually undertaken several studies over the last several years by reducing that soot, those particulate matter emissions from these engines and the use of renewable diesel. We can actually reduce the number of documented asthma cases, lung disease, cancers, and those have very, very real financial benefits to a community as well.
Great. So thank you so much for everyone for your presentations, your comments, and great answers to questions. Any other final thoughts before we close out the webinar? All right. Well, just a quick reminder to everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and we will be sharing this recording and the slides on our website. We'll send a quick message following that up, and if you are interested in following up with us, here's our social channels, and yeah, have a great rest of your day.
Happy holidays, everybody.